My name is Mario Nanos. I'm the president and co-founder of Washtenaw Families Against Narcotics. It's our organization that is bringing this to all of you, our community, and some of you, many of you who are not in our community, but in spirit, you are a part of our community. This has been incredible for Washtenaw Fan, getting to know both Natasha and Kristen. They're awesome people. If one of the reasons I wanted to talk, besides wanting to thank all of you for joining this meeting and the subsequent meetings, is that if you think this is a good idea, we are open at Washtenaw Fan to doing more of this kind of thing. You just need to let us know through our website. Some of you know us. If you know of a book out there that's as awesome as Natasha's and Kristen's, I'm known to just send kind of blind emails and hope for the best. And you never know when you're going to run into people like Kristen and Natasha who agreed to do this with us. So let us know, including ideas on books. There are no guarantees, okay? Because we get a lot of requests, but you never know. So before I turn it over back to Natasha and Kristen, just know that Washtenaw Fan does a lot for people in our community, including yoga for recovery. We're doing some acupressure classes in conjunction with an app that was developed by the University of Michigan. Many of these things are available virtually. So regardless of where you are, and I know that this audience is coming from, these numbers aren't exact, but 7 or 8 different states, 2 different countries. It's really been unbelievable, the support that we're getting from all of you. So with that, thank you so much for joining, and hope you guys learn a lot. One other thing, Corporate Fan, our corporate chapter, keeps track of the mental illnesses that are most prevalent in terms of the people that we help get connected to resources. The 2 most common are depression and anxiety. And as many of you have been reading in the media, it's not a good time right now for people battling depression and or anxiety. So the timing of this meeting right now couldn't be better. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen and Natasha. Thanks everybody for joining in.
Thank you so much, Mario.
Take care, guys.
All right. Thank you. Thanks so much to Mario and Washtenaw Fan and the whole WFAN crew. They've been amazing and provided great support for us. And like he said, we've actually had people register from, I think it was 17 states and 2 countries. So a great turnout and a really nice opportunity for us to all come together to discuss some of these really important topics that many of us are struggling with right now, especially. Before I turn it over to Kristen, I do want to just let folks know that through a little technical snafu, many of you came in as Natasha Duarte. I see many of you have figured out how to change your name. Feel free to, but if you don't want to, you don't need to. Kristen and I thought that it would also be fun to add either with your name, if you are changing your name, or instead of your name, your favorite superhero or cartoon character or your favorite food. Yeah, so that's it. And if you need help changing your name, there should be a little more button next to your name in the participant list, and you can click on that and rename yourself, or click on the 3 dots next to your name and rename yourself that way. And if you could come in and stay muted until there's time for conversation, that would be great. And my last little housekeeping announcement is we had a number of requests from people to record this session. And so we are going to be recording it, just so you know that. and making it available. And if at some point, maybe you want to use a different name or not your name or stay Natasha, if that's a concern for you, I guess I'll say. But we'll be doing a lot of stuff through chat, and we can always cut out people's voices or the dialogue part if we have some more verbal discussion. And I don't think I said, actually, I just started talking because I was in conversation with Mario initially, but I'm Natasha Duarte, one of the co-authors. And I'm going to be doing a lot of the moderating, and Kristen Allett is going to be doing a lot of the talking. And so with that, Kristen,
people who wrote this book.
And if folks can just stay muted, that would be super helpful, for us to get a clean recording and for us to not have too many background voices. But with that, Kristen Allett, I'd like to invite you to share your screen, and and we'll get going with the book.
Excellent. Well, I want to just take a moment to thank not only Mario, but the whole team at Washington. They've been really fabulous. Mario heard me speak on a podcast and reached out and said, would you consider speaking? And I looked at his website, which I would encourage you all to take a look at. And we did a talk in July, and that went so well that there was a donor through Washington that made available a whole bunch of books. And so we reached out. Some of you are aware that, and hopefully have gotten the books. Maybe Natasha will talk a little bit about that. But I just wanted to say that was through a donor at Washington, because they were really committed that everybody at all economic levels have access to this material. And if you got a book, it would be wonderful to email the Washington and thank them for it, because that was just an amazing gift that they offered. Natasha, do you want to say anything about the books?
I'll just say, those of you, we got 107 books distributed to folks, which is amazing. And I'd just like to echo Kristen's thanks to WFAN doing really an above and beyond job in helping folks access the information. And there was a delay in some of the hard copy books that shipped out. Everybody who requested the electronic copy should have received a link for that. But yeah, so we just apologize for that. I did send out a link to the introduction in chapter 1, just eVersion. And you should have been receiving, I heard from some folks that it came actually on Saturday, which was great. But it might be coming today or tomorrow for a few other folks. So we apologize for that delay.
Okay. So let's get going. Okay. I'm Dr. Kristen Allett. Just in case if you haven't met, I'm a naturopathic physician in the state of Washington. And although I'm a physician, this information is really for educational and informational purposes. And what we're talking about tonight, I think is really solid information around. We're going to talk a little bit about anxiety, probably, but it's not constitute medical advice, consultation, diagnosis, or treatment. And if you have any questions about what we're doing, you should consult with you. Certainly you can ask questions, but ultimately applying it, that's between you and your provider. So we are going to do polls. Yes.
Yeah. So, and I'll just pick this back up a little bit. So we're actually going to do it through chat. And so we have 2 yes or no questions, just so we can get a feel for where you guys are at. And if you've had a chance, for those of you who have the book in hand, to look at the book. So Kristen, why don't you go ahead and click, and we'll put the first question up. So the way the book club is being run is we're having 3 sessions, which hopefully you all know. And you don't have to necessarily be able to come to all 3 of them, but the workbook is in 3 sections, 3 chapters for each section. And so in this first one, we're really going to be focusing on chapters 1 through 3. So if you all could just put in the chat box, if you've had a chance to read chapters 1 through 3 of the workbook, or
And if not, no problem.
not
They're
at all.
Still,
It'll just help
still
us.
very valuable to be here, but
Yeah.
just curious where the range is.
Yeah. So we've got a couple yeses. Someone just got their book just today. So no. Someone read it a month ago. Some folks have only read chapter 1. A couple no, not yet. Unfortunately, just got the book 30 minutes ago. Well, so that was a little hurdle we had to get over. So thank you for hanging into that. And someone else is partly into chapter 3. And so the second question, and we put, so the question is, have you tried any of the activities or experiments from the website or the workbook? I don't know if any of you have had a chance to explore kristenallett.com. But we have a lot
from the talk in July.
Or from the talk in July, where we offered up some tools and worksheets, and there's definitely overlap. And so we're just curious whether it was from reading the book or not, if you've had a chance to sort of look into that. And so we're getting a bunch of yeses, yes, but it's been a little while, some exercises, yes, from the website, which is great. The protein before bedtime, that's a favorite for a lot of folks. So thank you for sharing that.
And there's a few people that haven't had any chance to do that. And so we're going to set up some experiments if you want. So.
Yeah, just the increasing, just adding a little protein in. Yes, but it's been a few weeks. Okay, great. And this just helps us get a feel for where you all are at. And so, yeah, so thank you so much. And we are going to be using chat for a lot of the questions, but I did want to just say that if it's just easier, if you don't want to type, or if it's a little bit more involved, you can put in chat that you would like to unmute and ask your question verbally, or under reactions, depending on what kind of device you're on, you can raise your hand and I'll see you that way and call on you. But otherwise, if you're comfortable with it, you can just put your question into chat and I will be your voice reading it for you guys.
So as we go, if you have questions, because we're kind of a mixed group, but I'm gonna go over some of the basic material, and we're gonna look at one particular thing, and we're gonna kind of do this where you participate, just so that it's not just me talking, because that gets boring for both sides of it. So feel free to put it into the chat box if you have any questions.
And Kristen, just before you get going, just because a handful of more people just joined, I'll just say that you'll notice that there are a lot of Natasha Duarte's who joined, because I didn't realize that we each had unique links. So when I set up the reminder emails, I just used my link. So feel free to rename yourself or not, or put in your favorite superhero or cartoon character or your favorite food. And I just wanted to throw that out there before you got going, Kristen.
Great. So one of the concepts that we start out in the book is like how to think about really fatigue, anxiety, depression, mental clarity issues, addictions, all of those. And when I work with people clinically, I kind of start, as they start to tell their story, I start putting things into 4 different buckets. And the buckets are the following. So there's our body, which is our power supply, our brain, which is our hardware, our relationships, which is sort of the input output into our life. And so that can be other humans or animals or nature or jobs or COVID. All of this is kind of adds or subtracts from our energy supply and what's happening in our brain. And then I like to distinguish our mind from our brain. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but your brain will lie to you. And it's got a lot of hardware that sometimes isn't always helpful. And I like to distinguish that from our mind. And Dan Siegel defines the mind as an emergent property that arises out of the brain, the body, and our relationships. And so what's an emergent property? So an emergent property is like clouds. So I assume we're all cloud believers. At some point in time, we've stood under a cloudy sky and gotten rained or snowed on. But we know that if we go up into an airplane and put a box out into a cloud and close the lid, we're not going to bring a cloud into a room because it needs to be in those specific conditions. And when we are in specific conditions, our mind can arise. And how I recognize a mind is particularly anybody's mind, but there's a sense of curiosity and compassion can arise, and the ability to be in the present moment, where our brain tends to want to be in the past or way into the future, but not kind of solidly in what's happening right now. And for those of us who have ever been sick, really sick with like a cold or flu, and hopefully not COVID, but when our power supply is taxed, usually we're not very curious and we're not very compassionate. But this can also happen with addictions or hangovers or physical health problems. And so in my practice, part of what I have really focused on is how do we improve the power supply? Because if we improve the power supply, then the hardware works better and we have more input, more energy for our relationships, and it's more likely our mind is going to arise. And so the focus of the book is mainly like, how do you improve your power supply so that your brain is working better? That's sort of the connection that I focus on. Often therapists are working on how do you improve the relationships so that your brain mind is working together. So I tend to be on this end of the spectrum. So the three things that we really focus on in the book is the importance of small, frequent meals, including protein, carbs, fat, and fiber, getting at least 7 to 9 hours of sleep at consistent times. Occasional naps are good, and moving your body, because these are the three things that really impact our body, our hormones, our neurology, so that we can feel better. And so the first really two sections of the book are focused on the food piece, because that I actually see make a really big impact in the immediate term, like in the here and now. And the sleep and movement are really good long-term investments. So we focus on that in the third part of the book. So any questions about that? And I want to run through some of the physiology that was in chapter 3, in part because even though Natasha and I worked really hard in writing chapter 3 so that it's readable, most people aren't like, yes, physiology, this is going to be awesome, what I always want to read. And we kind of put some stories in there. So don't avoid chapter 3, because there are a couple of good stories in there pulling it all together. But if you're a verbal or visual learner, these next couple of slides might make a difference. And then I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions, because I just want to make sure people understand the physiology. And I've worked through this physiology probably with 1,000 people. So every possible question has been asked. So if you don't get something, please ask, because I would rather you get it. And it's always nice to have a new question, but I've had a lot of people ask questions of this. So it's been a refined process. So let's talk about what happens when we go too long for our body without eating, which happens pretty easily, right? It's a busy day. We skip lunch, we skip breakfast. Like what happens in the body when we go 5, 8, 10 hours without eating? So our brain notices that the fuel supply is declining, and our main fuel supply is glucose. And so the brain says to the body, hey, we need more fuel. And they're not interested in going to the refrigerator or the grocery store and getting us food. So body, you need to make food. And there's a whole bunch of hormones involved in that. And I'm not going to go into details of all those hormones, but we're going to watch one because it affects both the brain and the body. And that's called adrenaline. And so then all these hormones are going to go to the liver and say, hey, liver, we need some more fuel. And we need specifically glucose for our brain. Fat tissue is always sitting there waiting for glucose to go by. It's come on in, have a seat. We'll never have you leave because we don't know why we would let you leave, but good to know. Like, so the challenge, the really sad challenge is that as humans, as Homo sapiens, we cannot make glucose out of fat. Other mammals have that possibility. We do not. It's very sad. So we can only make it out of protein. And that protein is either going to come from our diet or ultimately it's going to come from our muscle mass because that's our biggest storage unit. And if we do that once, who cares? But if we do that day after day after day, month after month after month, it starts to add up because muscle mass sets our metabolic rate, which was one of the things that determines how many calories we eat in a day. Now, I know mostly we're here to talk about mental health, but I'm assuming that diet culture has planted some things in your brain that maybe you wanted there or maybe you didn't want there. I'm just saying. And so really I just bring that up because muscle mass is really a huge determinant of how many calories we're burning. But muscle mass does other really important things, such as when we move our body, we get brain-derived neurotropic factor. And, if you're bored while I'm talking and you want to look something up, look up brain-derived neurotropic factor, even in Wikipedia. Like this helps you learn faster and have your synaptic connections tighter together. And like anybody here not need to learn faster? Considering that information is doubling every 2 weeks, like what does that mean? Anyway, so brain-derived neurotropic factor, but it has also been shown that low brain-derived neurotropic factor is involved in anxiety and bipolar conditions. And so we want as much brain-derived neurotropic factor as we can get. And when we move our body, and we get brain-derived neurotropic factor when we move our body, such as in movement and exercise, but when we have lots of muscle mass, it also makes it harder for us to get insulin receptivity diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, dementia, to just name a few. And ultimately, fat likes to be burned by our muscle mass. So although we're going to talk a lot about diet, if I could long-term get people doing one thing for their mental and physical health, it would be making sure you have a good exercise program and specifically build muscle mass, particularly if you're over 45. So let's just pause again, because I've talked about a lot of different things, but when we don't eat, right, when we go a long time without fueling our brain, we get adrenaline, which we're going to talk about what that does to our brain in a minute, but we start breaking down our muscle mass in order to support our brain, right? And long term, that sets us up for a number of health conditions and is not great on our brain because this and our stress levels because adrenaline's around. Does that make sense to people? Any questions on this slide?
And if we move past it, you can always type it in and we can circle
Absolutely.
back. One thing that did come in, Kristen, I just want to share is that diet culture that you mentioned, like that's worth talking about because some of us may make food choices or try to not eat certain things because of the messaging from that diet culture. And that can actually make mental health conditions worse or
Absolutely.
more challenging. And so
Yeah.
even though this book and, Kristen and I don't really spend a lot of time talking about like weight loss, it factors into decisions people make around how they fuel their brain and their body. And so it's worth mentioning here, I think.
And and so I'm just going to put out our bias because like here we are, we wrote a book, it talks about food. So somehow we've entered the diet culture stream, right? And our little sidestep, and I think this is a really important sidestep, is in my view, having good energy and mental clarity is so much more important than the size of a body or the size of the body, because unless we have energy and mental clarity and we have reduced anxiety and we feel good mentally and emotionally, like we can't take care of our body. And the only way we know how to do that is through experiments and seeing if that works for us. And so part of the book and part of what we advocate for is here, understand how your body tends to work, and then do experiments to see if it helps you. And then do what helps you have more energy and mental clarity, because that's usually a useful path, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes I just did a talk to a group of CEOs, and this guy was like, well, I did intermittent fasting and keto, and I felt exhausted and horrible, but I looked great. And I was like, okay. And he's like, but I wanted to look great and have lots of energy and mental clarity. I'm like, well, you didn't find the right combination, right? Like, like sometimes you have to prioritize. When people come into my office, like usually they're depressed, anxious, or have an addiction and have fatigue. And so we're going to prioritize those. And everybody's different. I'm not saying any one thing is wrong, but always protect your energy and mental clarity is what I kind of.
Yeah. And Kristen, I don't know if you had seen that, but we did have 2 questions come in about intermittent fasting. So timely. And one was intermittent fasting and cancer, but I don't know if we want to hold that if we have time, or if you want to at the end, or if you want to address it.
I'm going to totally sidestep that question, because that question should be directed at somebody who specializes in cancer. There's a lot of really good, I just did a CE on cancer. I'm aware of that, but it's not my specialty. And what I've seen with people with mental health histories and cancer is you have to balance those priorities. And so I would work closely with the knowledgeable provider on that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And the other thing that I'll just say is we do have a blog post about and a worksheet about, is this diet for me? Is it for you? Which talks about different priorities around choosing how to fuel yourself, and how to, one person thinks it's the best thing for them. It may not be the best thing for everybody, though. And so I can put a link in the chat to that blog as we go along. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about how the brain. So we just talked about the body. So let's move on to the brain. And so first, let's talk about how your brain brings in information and makes decisions. And so the first thing that happens is, so the brain is basically in a box and only knows that anything's going on because it comes in through our senses, what we hear, smell, taste, feel, and intuit in our body, right? So there's a nerve conduction to the brain to be like, hey, there's a crazy woman waving her hands around on a screen that is not in the room, just letting you know. And in that second step was perception. So your brain started labeling what it was seeing. Oh, there, somebody's talking, she's waving her hands. I know what a hand is. She's wearing a blue coat. So it starts labeling things. And some of those labels have also emotions attached to it. So it's like a tagging system, right? And so if you have ever been bit by a bird, you might be afraid of birds, right? And so like certain birds are going to be associated with certain emotions. And then there's thought processes go along with that. And then there's behaviors. And so if you've been bit by a bird, like a cockatoo, let's say, or a rooster, I grew up with a rooster, and like they can be a little aggressive, right? And so, generally white things I'm not afraid of. White birds I'm not afraid of. White birds that look like a rooster, now I have a little more heightened awareness, right? And then when they start running at me, my thought is like, oh crap, he's in a protective mode, I need to run. And so now my actions are taking place, right? And so that's the process. Often we go from sensation to behavior and we don't break down what those are. And often therapy helps us break those down so that we have more choices on, see a beer, drink a beer. Like we can separate those actions a little, right? So that we're not feeding our addictions, perhaps. The other thing you should know is the blood supply in the brain goes from the areas that go to sensation, to perception, to emotions, to thoughts, to behaviors. So the last part of your brain, in your prefrontal cortex, that gets glucose and nutrients are the ones that have you take action, right? Thoughtful action. Habitual action is regulated down here, but thoughtful action is the last stop on the train. So let's talk about your brain. Many ways to slice and dice the brain. I like to slice it into 3 different components. Let's talk about those different components and how they influence what we're doing. So there's the prefrontal cortex located right up here. This is abstract thinking and executive functioning. And if I ask you, do you know anybody who has depression, anxiety, or addiction? I bet you can immediately think of somebody in your life that that I've never met, right? That's associative thinking. And the reason why I highlight that is like computers don't actually do that particularly well. And so, so part of why we stay employed is our associative thinking ability, because we're all competing with computers at some level, problem solving, and the inhibition of the limbic system, or what I call the lizard brain, way down here. And so part of what therapy does is that it helps us send tracks of neural nets to say to our lizard, shh, it's okay. So then there's our lizard brain, which is solely responsible for us to not die. It doesn't really care if we live a good life or not, or even a marginal life. It just wants us to stay alive. And so its job is to either flee or fight if our life is threatened, or sometimes it has noticed that the best way to do is stick our head in the sand. And this is called disappear. I call it disappear, where you're like, la, 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 la. And for me, this has been a pint of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. Like Cherry Garcia is pretty consistent on what's going to happen with a pint of Cherry Garcia ice cream, right? And in the last 2 years, I have had ample opportunity to consider the benefits of Cherry Garcia. Other people, that's alcohol or substance use. That can be Facebook, that can be other sugar substances. But what we're looking for in the disappear is pretty consistent emotional response. Like, if I do this, like, then it's not going to change very much, because I'm concerned about my survival and I want to stay in this mode. The other problem with the lizard brain is we have access to what I call the old records. And these are old survival records or old habitual records that maybe were really useful in childhood that are not very useful in the moment, right? And so the story that I generally tell around this is, so I practiced martial arts for 22 years. If we were in the room together, you would be like, she is tall, because I'm 5'11", and I'm about 180 pounds, which makes me slightly bigger than the average guy that comes and does Aikido. And so this guy who was about 5'7" came in, and it was a beginner's class. I'm a black belt. And we bow in, and my brain is yelling at me, he's going to kill you. I'm like, fascinating. Why is he going to kill you? And I'm working my way through that, in that, like, he's not bigger than me. He doesn't look competent doing martial arts. He doesn't look stoned or high. And then finally I get to, like, gee, Chris, when was the last time you ate? Oh, it has been over 10 hours since we last ate. Maybe the reason why I think that this gentleman, who's probably terrified because he's training with a black belt, is going to kill you is because I haven't eaten, right? Because I'm so deep down here, and my life has been threatened a number of times. I don't know why he was familiar. Like, maybe he had the same color, eye color or hair color. I don't really know. But boy, my limbic system was sending a pretty strong signal that my life was under threat, and it had nothing to do with what was in front of me. And I stepped off the mat and got some food. So when we have no adrenaline in the system, all of our sensory information goes into their prefrontal cortex and our hippocampus. However, if we have any adrenaline in the system, may that because a bear came into the room we're in, or because we have gone too long without eating, all the sensory information gets dropped into our lizard brain, and our prefrontal cortex starts to drop out, and our hippocampus becomes really connected to our lizard brain versus what our hippocampus was, our prefrontal cortex. And our hippocampus decides where our attention, motions, planning, and behavior towards others were. So you can see, when I was hypoglycemic, my attention and emotion, and we were moving towards planning on, what am I going to do with somebody who's threatening my life, right? Like, right? How this plays into addictions is that I've had a number of people who were in recovery, let's say for alcohol, and they go to the grocery store, there's no food in the house. They walk around, they buy a bag of groceries, they get home and they start emptying it, and there's a bottle of wine. And it's not that they decided they were going to drink, it's just that the lizard brain played the old record, and the attention and planning and behaviors were down here and not in our abstract and problem-solving brain, which is like, I'm not drinking anymore. Does that make sense to people? So we really need to pay attention to how much adrenaline's in our system, because then we know if our brain's toggling to our prefrontal cortex or toggling towards our lizard brain. And it's very subtle on those differences. Any questions on this slide?
We have a couple of yeses that's making sense.
Great. It's so helpful that you respond, because sometimes I get the impression I'm sitting in a room by myself, and there's a few people I can see, and I so appreciate that you're nodding your head and putting your thumbs up, and because otherwise my brain's like, do you know you're just talking to your computer? Nobody is out there. Yeah. Because my old wiring isn't completely convinced that Zoom exists. So let's talk about what happens when we eat food.
Oh, hang on. We have one question that came in. Why does not eating strike the lizard brain?
So when going back here, when we go a long time without eating, part of the cocktail of hormones that gets released is adrenaline. And the reality is there's a spectrum of people out there whose limbic system, this limbic system, our survival brain, gets wired really differently based on our histories. So if we had a lovely, pleasant childhood where we had parents who supported us and challenged us, but didn't beat us or didn't scare us or didn't, then and we've never been traumatized and COVID hasn't traumatized us. Our limbic system is not very sensitive to adrenaline. And so there are people out there who can go a long time without eating. They can do intermittent fasting, they can do keto. But what I've found is that there are people who have had challenging, if not horrific, childhoods that they are lucky to have survived. And that put receptors that make people really sensitive to the smallest amount of adrenaline in the system. And we can wire away from that, but it takes years in practice to do that. And so some people, what I find is when they go a long time without eating, their body puts a little adrenaline in their system, but their lizard brain is like, oh my God, the world's coming to an end and my life is at threat. And it's just the smallest amount. Hopefully that answers the person's question.
Yeah, they typed in, got it, helpful.
Yeah. Moving this along. So when we have just carbohydrates, when I talk to people, I'm like, hey, what do you have for breakfast? Either because I'm in the Seattle area, like either they skip breakfast and just have coffee, or they have a piece of toast or a scone or a bagel. And when we have pretty much straight carbohydrates, what happens is our blood glucose lasts for our brain about 1.5 to 2 hours. And after that, I need to correct that. After that, our blood glucose is declining and our brain's like, we have 5 Zoom meetings where we have one Zoom meeting and we're texting and we're IMing and we have to, and then there's a kid in the back and like we are doing all this multitasking and we do not have enough glucose from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. And so the adrenaline starts to kick in order to get the glucose back up. Right. And then we start getting jittery. We start having cravings for substances or sugar, right? Like we start not feeling awesome. The other thing that I want to point out about sugar or alcohol, particularly on those days that you have terrible, horrible, no good days, anybody in the last 18 months, right? Like, when we have a terrible, horrible, no good day, often people crave sugar or alcohol. And part of that is because there's this intuitive intelligence about what sugar and alcohol do for our nervous system. And it takes about 20 minutes for the sugar to go into the system and a whole bunch of biochemistry that I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of details of, but more tryptophan crosses the blood-brain barrier and to help make serotonin. Serotonin's the signal everything's going to be okay, right? And so the reason why I tell you that is, first of all, sugar is always better than alcohol, hands down, particularly if you're in recovery. Like, let's focus on the sugar. For me, what I do is I say to my committee, like, oh, wow, that was just a horrible day. And my committee's like, Ben & Jerry's or Cherry Garcia ice cream. Let's do this, right? Let's do that. We want the entire pint. And I'm like, I know you want the entire pint. And given what happened, you probably deserve the entire pint. But we're going to scoop out 2 scoops into a bowl and we're going to eat it. And you can have the rest of the pint in 20 minutes. Because it takes 20 minutes for the tryptophan to cross the blood-brain barrier and give me a signal that everything's okay. And my blood glucose goes a little higher because I got some sugar in my ice cream. And 90% of the time, I don't have to eat the entire pint. Now, to be honest, I have ate a couple of pints of ice cream in under 20 minutes in the last year and a half. I'm not saying that this is a foolproof, but when you understand the physiology, it's just a little easier to slow that cycle down if you happen to have the habit of overdoing it on the carbs.
Mhm.
So hopefully that makes sense to people.
Kristen, does this apply to children as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, it probably happens a little faster in children is what I've seen is if you give them a little bit of sugar and not an overdose of sugar, like they're like, hey, I really want sugar. You give them, you're like, here's just a couple and see if you feel better. But the other thing that children do is they also get a dopamine reward off of it, right? And so everybody here understands. Like I was noticing it. I was kind of stressed out earlier this week, and I bought myself some chocolate things, and I popped one in my mouth, and my brain was immediately like, "Let's do the other one," right? Because I wanted that reward. And I was like, well, why don't you wait until all the chocolate is out of your mouth before you put the other one in? Because it's not going to help any, right? Like, let's just wait. And there can be this like more. And we really want to just see if we can put a pause on that through our prefrontal cortex. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm giving you some support to do it.
And is fruit sugar the same to our brains, like the Cherry Garcia or other ice cream or treats?
That's a great lead to the next part of my talk. So I am going to talk about that. So when we have straight sugar, like licorice vines, red licorice vines, or soda, our glucose goes up and comes back down pretty quickly. And it'll shoot so high that it starts to create a little inflammation, which also contributes to mental health problems. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about that, but we're going to say inflammation's bad. And catch this curve. Like this is I call this the ski slope curve, and it's really hard to stop this. And so like in the stock market, if the stock market is falling too quickly, they have automatic stops because it just keeps falling. Our body does not have an automatic stop, and we'll go deep into the adrenaline zone because our body doesn't have the resources, particularly if we do this on a regular basis, to pull it out. Now, if we have a piece of fruit, check this out, right? So same amount of carbs, because the fruit is, the carbs are connected to fiber, and your body has to like, and it starts to break it out. Like it breaks out over time in a different way. And it's not so sharp of a curve, so that when it gets low, the body's like, oh, we need to, because we have other resources like glycogen that it can correct it without being this big adrenaline event. When we have just protein, it takes about 1.5 to 2 hours to convert the protein into glucose. And so I was working with this one woman. She was sent in to see me, and she was about to quit her job because she was just crying in the bathroom all the time. And she was tired of crying in the bathroom. And so someone sent her and was like, you got to go talk to Dr. Allett before you quit your job. And so she comes in, and I was like, so what's going on? She's like, I just don't want to cry in the bathroom anymore. I'm tired. Like, I don't know what's going on. And I'm like, so what's changed in your job? And she's like, nothing's changed in my job. I love my job. I love what I do. I'm just tired of crying. I don't know if it's menopause or whatever, but I'm not crying anymore. I'm like, okay. And then I was like, anything going on in your home life with family? And she's like, no, I have the perfect family and the perfect husband. And I'm like, okay, fine. I get it. You're not going to give me any emotional information. Let's talk about your food. And she was doing a high protein bar that had no carbohydrates in it for breakfast and lunch. So that's basically waking up in the morning when where blood glucose is naturally low, not giving her body her smart brain, any fuel to work on. And so she's living in this adrenaline zone for the first few hours at work and crying in the bathroom because her lizard brain is like, I'm in survival mode, but I don't know why I'm in survival mode, but it's really, really hard, right? And then she would recover and have lunch, and then she would drop into it in the late afternoon until she had a decent dinner, right? And so I was like, okay, because I made her promise. We saw each other on Monday, and I was like, don't quit your job until Friday. I want to see you on Wednesday. So we swapped her no carb, high protein bar for a Cliff bar that has carbs and protein. And next time we meet, we'll talk about how to interpret labels, but it was a better carb to protein ratio for the amount of intellectual work she was doing. And by Tuesday afternoon, she called me and said, I'm canceling my Wednesday appointment because I'm much better. I'll come see you later. And I was like, awesome. And then fat does influence our glucose. It's just a little, it's complicated physiology but I'm just going to say it kind of bumps it a little. And so when we eat meals and snack that have carbs and fiber, so that's our apple, protein, and a little bit of fat, our blood glucose is more stable than if we're just doing sugar, or protein, or fat. Does that make sense to people? Any questions about that?
We had a follow-up question about whether it's like a whole apple or like something that's sweetened with fructose, which is fruit sugar. But that's not what you're talking about, right? You're talking about like a whole fruit.
This is a whole fruit. So something that just has fructose in it doesn't immediately, like agave juice, doesn't immediately bump up it does not release insulin. It'll bump up our glucose a little, but it also will get a high insulin, like it plays around. Not explaining this very well. It impacts our glucose. It varies from person to person, and it's worth doing the experiment. But I would say that it just counts as a carb, right? Like that's your carb. And part of what we want to focus on is making sure, just doing the experiment, if you have carb, protein, fat, and fiber, do you just have more energy and mental clarity is really what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm. So we got a bunch of yeses that makes sense. And then a question, what would be the ideal breakfast smoothie to make?
One that you enjoy that has 20 grams of protein in it, some carbohydrates, a fiber, and a fat source. So that, and what you enjoy like varies from person to person to person. Like smoothies is like as individual. And so usually it's like a whey protein powder, maybe a little bit of coconut milk for the fat, some raspberries have a ton of fiber in them and a lot of bioflavonoids. So maybe some raspberries or blueberries. Like I'd put a little more fiber in that in terms of chia seeds or flax seeds. And then I've had people put peanut butter in there because they really like the taste of peanut butter. And then figuring out like what keeps you filled for 3 to 4 hours and then, but is not too much. Like it's about doing experiments, but that's an idea.
Yeah. And the next section of the book, we get into a lot more experiments and we'll be sort of setting you up teeing you all up at the end of this book club session for the next one to get into that. Yeah. Sorry, one more question, if that's all right. Is putting protein in your coffee in place of creamer with a carb okay? You mean like a whey powder maybe?
Well, you could do coffee, protein, creamer, and a little bit of sugar. I call that like What I would do is like coffee ice cream in a blender with some protein powder in it, if you're going to do that. But,
Yeah.
or just coffee and an egg, right? Like, how about an egg?
Mhm.
Right? And coffee with creamer and a little bit of sugar and an egg, or coffee and an egg and a piece of toast. Yeah. Right. Like,
And hard-boiled eggs go far. I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, I don't have time. I need something I can like eat, like take out the door with me. If you're one of those people like, and you can tolerate and like eggs, hard-boiled eggs are like such a
you can
great to
pre-cook
go.
them, and they
Yep.
just sit there and they go fast.
They come in their own peel, so it can kind of stay
Yeah.
clean depending on how you're transporting it.
We're going to talk more about that, but next time, particularly, we're going to do a lot with food next time. But I want to get to a couple of quick tools to try between now and the next time we meet, so because we're going to ask you about that. But in summary, we want to know that your brain's going to use your body for fuel if it's not fed, because a lot of people don't even like think about like, how am I feeding my brain when I haven't eaten all day and I'm melting down? Well, you're using your body. And when you use your body, it's going to require adrenaline. And if you use your body for food over years, you're going to have obesity, decreased muscle mass, decreased metabolic rate, and decreased brain-derived neurotropic factor. And so like things are just going to be hard over time. The brain, when being fed from the body, exposed to adrenaline, which shifts us from our smart brain to our not so smart brain, and makes it harder to recover from trauma, and make it harder to stay away from addictions. Because when we're in our limbic system, our willpower is super low, and we're responding from the past, and everything is either let's run from it, kill it, or stick our head in the sand. So that's kind of the summary. So what are we going to do about this? What are some tools that we can not spend so much time in our limbic system? So if you have the book, it would be great to open up to page 20, and Natasha is going to throw the link. We have a link to what impacts anxiety. And I'm just curious to like, what of the things on here, or what do you do that help decrease your anxiety, or will set you up for anxiety?
And so I just put that link for folks who don't have the book right with them, or maybe just got it. You can crack it open, but there's a link in the chat to an online PDF of that form. And you can just put your answers right in the chat box. We'll just give folks a minute. And Kristen, I think if you click a couple times, the questions you asked will come up on this slide. And so that might also just be a good prompt for folks.
Yeah. So what behaviors and foods reduce your anxiety, and what behaviors and food can increase your anxiety?
Yeah. So one person says mindfulness meditation has really helped them recently. Lack of sleep increases anxiety. How
do people do with caffeine?
Exercise, someone says. Exercise reduces it.
Awesome.
Breathing and exercise help.
Yep.
Laughing decreases it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here we go. A bunch coming in. Uncertainty with medical issues or medical situation increases anxiety. Laughing decreases it. An accelerator, sugary foods. And I assume outside time, yoga is the helper. Deep breathing helps decrease it. Uncertainty increases it. Something a lot of us are coping with right now. Caffeine increases it. Switched to tea years ago for less caffeine in the morning. Movement and sleep. Connections help decrease anxiety. Stressful day and lack of sleep increase. Yoga equals reduce. News equals increase. Internet equals increase. Caffeine and no food is a killer. Prayer, water, exercise all help. Yoga, going to my happy place in my mind. Rest helps. Coffee only in the morning. Great answers here, you guys. Thank you.
Yeah.
Alcohol and cigarette increase anxiety.
I want to just
though at
catch
first
that. I want to comment on that particular one, in that, like, someone wrote that alcohol and cigarettes increase anxiety, but it initially decreases it. And that's absolutely right, in that in the moment, it decreases anxiety. And then our brain is in a less able to manage the anxiety after that. There's like this, like, boom, and then it gets bigger. And part of what I really focus on is like, what can we do to help our brain body, both the neurobiology, the receptors and neurotransmitters, and the endocrinology, be stable enough so that our brain is stable. And both of those will destabilize. It's kind of like me and a pint of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. First, it really decreases what I'm feeling, and then it makes everything worse. But these are some great answers. And I just want to look at, like, the list of, like, what people know about themselves, because you've done the experiments. And so, you know, one of the things I want to just add to your repertoire is food, because this piece, I think, gets missed regularly. And one of the tools that we talk about in the book early on is lizard brain treats. And the most basic form of a lizard brain treat is a little bit of apple juice, like a quarter cup of apple juice or any kind of fruit juice, and a handful of nuts. The juice is a really quick carbohydrate that can get to your brain and fuel your brain. And then the nuts is a fiber, protein source that will slow release so that we don't have that sharp drop. And when is it helpful? Well, here are 4 places that it's really helpful. Is when somebody is in their lizard brain. And by the way, you should all know, never, ever talk to a lizard, right? And I have ample opportunity, because now almost everything's virtual, and I'll have an appointment where somebody comes in and they're like, and I'm like, whoa, like, pick up your computer and let's go to the kitchen and find you some food. They're like, there is nothing in the kitchen. There is nothing to eat. There is absolutely nothing to eat. And I'm like, I bet there is a bowl full of sugar. Let's go get some sugar. Like, we have to get some fuel to your prefrontal cortex. And they get into the kitchen, inevitably there is always food. And they get a little bit of sugar and a little bit of protein. And in 10 minutes, they go from this, like, melting down person to, like, and you can watch them and they just click in and they're like, hey, and I'm like, hey, and they're like, hey, and I'm like, what is going on? And they're like, oh, I had a day. And so either with yourself or somebody who's around you who's having a hard time, like, one of the things that you can try as an experiment, and particularly if you have adolescent children or young children who are melting down, like, getting them a little bit of juice and a little bit of protein, and seeing if they calm down enough that you can have a conversation. The other place that lizard brain treats are really helpful is early morning waking. There's a lot of people who are not hungry in the mornings. And part of the reason why they're not hungry is because when we have adrenaline in our system, the blood is no longer going to our digestive system and is being shunted into our muscles so that we can fight or run. And so when we're not hungry, that means that we're way into hypoglycemia. And that can happen with early morning waking or 3 a.m. Waking, like when we wake at 3 a.m. with the committee member going, right? Like that kind of waking, right? That's also hypoglycemia along with nightmares. And so any of those are really good places to go, like, this is adrenaline in my system. I don't understand why I have adrenaline in my system, but this is adrenaline, and I'm going to get just a little bit of carbohydrates, not an entire pint of Ben and Jerry's ice cream, but a little bit, and then some protein to back that up. The last place that Lizard Brain Treats is really helpful is when you're changing from professional mode to family mode or back again, which is happening faster than it did pre-COVID, because usually somebody had to drive home. And now if they're working from home, they just have to open the closet door, and then, there's the 3 kids. But if you eat something before you change modes, you will transition better. Any questions about Lizard Brain Treats?
One person says that they struggle with switching from work to home and just eat to avoid home life. Adult kids struggling with addiction and cluttered house.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that's a pretty big insight, and partly true, like eat to avoid home. But also, I would say that you're eating to have the resources to be at home, right? So we can tell a negative story about it, or we can say, actually, this is a really good skill to have. And then we can look. Then one of the things you can do is look at what you're eating and improve it so that it's helping with your energy and mental clarity. Because I worked with somebody who did that exact same thing, but she did a bag of Doritos, and we swapped the bag of Doritos in for, she just got a bean burrito, a frozen bean burrito that she would nuke before she went home, because she had a pretty long drive and sometimes didn't get a decent dinner. And just having the burrito in the system for 45 minutes before she walked in the house made that transition more easier to do. And she was in a better place to cope with what she was responding to. And then she would just feed everybody, because she'd walk into a house of lizards and be like, and you get a treat, and you get a treat, and you get a treat. And now we're all making dinner together.
Mm-hmm. So one person says, wow, light bulb moment.
Awesome.
We like that. And then one person asked, if eating in the morning makes a person nauseous, should they still be encouraged to eat anyway?
Yeah. So if eating in the morning makes one nauseous, I would start with a little bit of juice, because usually we can get some fluid in, and then wait 20 minutes. And generally people can eat if you wait 20 minutes. And if you're still a little on the nauseous side, it generally takes your body about 5 to 7 days to be like, oh, yeah, like this is better if we eat, and like things will settle down. It takes a little bit to train the body to not have the hormonal release and all the things that are happening in your gut, and to be ready to eat, because your gut needs to know that food is coming to be ready for that.
Yeah. And this is another opportunity to just say, if this is an ongoing issue or isn't feeling right in your body, and you would know how it feels in your body, that's something that you can talk to your healthcare provider about specifically. I'm still feeling nauseous. This is what I've learned from this workbook about physiology. Is something else going on, or do I just need to push through this and retrain my body to accept it? But that's another good opportunity to just bring the workbook to your practitioner. Say, hey, have you seen this? I'm learning about this. How does it relate? So we have a number of other questions that have come in. One is, when they saw you speak a few years ago, Kristen, you also recommended a lizard brain treat if you wake up during the night and aren't able to go back to sleep.
Yeah. So let's talk about that just a little more. I kind of glossed over that. So very, very common happening is what I call 3 a.m. committee meetings, where you wake up and it's 2 hours. This isn't of being awake and pretty agitated. This is not like I got up, I peed, I laid in bed, and I went back to sleep. This is like, I got up, I peed, and then the committee's like, we should have said, and he should have said, and we're going to do, and da 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 da, and it lasts for about 2 hours. And generally speaking, when people get a little bit of juice or nuts, or right now, I'm really prone to this when I'm stressed. And so I have a jar of raspberry jelly, and I just get a spoon of raspberry jelly and a spoon of peanut butter, and I put it in my mouth, and I go back to bed. And generally I'm back asleep within the half hour. And so that really helps. The other thing that helps, because I saw a lot more of this as we went into COVID, is not getting enough exercise. Excuse me while I close the door. Helicopter decided to come. I don't know what they're doing this close, but when we don't move our bodies enough, we also are prone to 3 a.m. waking. We'll talk about why exercise helps us. But I saw a lot of people, I was like, you need to move your body or do a little yoga before you go to bed. Also helps with that. But getting a lizard brain treat right by the bedstand, if you can, if you're new to that, is helpful.
Yeah. We have another question about whether oatmeal with berries, a bit of ghee for a fat source, some raw pecans or walnuts. Is this would something like that be equivalent to the smoothie you described earlier?
So I don't know, because this means it needs to be in your body. And so when somebody eat whatever you decide to put in your body, you should ask yourself, do I have energy and mental clarity for 3 to 4 hours? And if I do, awesome. If it only lasts 2 hours, well, something's going on. And either I need more protein or something's going on. I just need to eat more frequently. And we're going to talk a little more about that when we get to part 2. But really, I encourage people to do experiments in their own body. And Natasha and I are just trying to give you the parameters on what is realistic to expect.
Yeah. One person offered that they keep a jar of trail mix of nuts and chocolate on the counter, available to all the lizards in her home.
Yes.
So good suggestion. Yeah.
Okay. So when we come back, I'm going to ask specifically at our next group, anybody try a lizard brain treat, and what were the results? If you were anxious, how much did it take you from a 9 out of a 10 down to, generally I see it'll drop you at least 3 points. So if you're a 9, it'll take you to a 6, which is better. Or early morning waking, did you get a chance? And you can also say it didn't work, right? But I want to survey people and see what the results are, right? And so if you want to do your homework, that would be one homework possibility. The other thing that I want to bring up, and this is really in part 2, but I wanted to just lean a little into it, so using the physiology that we understand, is lizard brain meals. And this is making sure that we are fueled for the important things that we need to do in our lives. And so making sure that we have a little more than a snack before we do something that like have an important meeting or a conversation, before we're doing something that requires a lot of emotional intelligence, or before making pivotal decisions, like really, having a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that has peanut butter. If you'll notice, this is not thinly layered peanut butter. This is generous peanut butter. And having that so that we are well fueled for the next hour and a half before we do that. Because our biological tendency when we're doing something that's going to be hard or emotionally challenging is we tend to not want to eat because historically, we were going to go do something physically hard, like kill a buffalo or go to war or fight for our lives, right? And so we naturally want more adrenaline in our system, but that doesn't help with the intellectual, emotional intelligence that we need to be in this society, particularly on top of virtual for almost everything. Any comments about this slide?
The last statement is awesome.
Awesome. So you saw what my last slide is going to be, which is, what is your 15% solution? Like, what is based on what we talked about today, and we've covered a ton of stuff, right? And I gave you 2 possible experiments, but there were other things that were kind of buried in there. What would you like to try in the next couple of weeks? And we're not going to track you down and make you report on it, but you could report on it. So that would be one thing that you can put in the chat box. And the other thing, we have about 15 more minutes, which is about perfect, that we can just open to Q&A. And I'm happy to dialogue about it. Some of it I might pitch in our later classes, but we're just going to have an open discussion. And you can either put in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand and turn off your microphone and ask the question when Natasha calls on you.
We do have one question, Kristen, about MCT oil and whether it feeds the brain faster than protein.
MCT oil, so medium chain fatty acids. So the idea behind that is, if you're in a ketotic state, our brain can use ketones. So one, you have to be doing a fully keto diet, and have been there for a while for that to be helpful. I personally, in my practice, have not found that keto diets there's a lot of really good research that keto diets are great for the brain. But what I have found in my particular population tends to have a lot of trauma, a lot of addictions, and still needs a high degree of emotional intelligence. And so I haven't found a lot of people who can do well on a keto diet because they either feel really deprived of all the yummy foods in the world, which then gets the lizard brain, or what I call I think we have young people in our brain. We all have multiple committee, and the kids really don't like it and will eventually sabotage it. And so I like having coconut milk and coconut oil in diets. I think it's really healthy to have some of it there because it's a really useful fatty acid. But unless we're in a keto state, I don't think that it's fueling the brain faster or less faster. The brain, my understanding of physiology is if glucose is available and has been available and we're not keto adapted, the brain's going to be like, bring on the glucose. And by the way, liver, please make it. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. And that goes a little bit to what Kristen was saying in terms of the type of folks that she works with in her clinical practice. It goes back to that sort of, is this diet for me? Is it for you? We hear a lot about keto. We hear a lot about intermittent fasting. We hear a lot about all these different things, but getting clear about what is your goal? What is your situation? Doing those experiments to see what works in your body. That's what we spend a lot of time talking about. And it's not that those other things aren't great for different reasons. There's just different reasons to follow different dietary protocols. And towards that end, Kristen, we do have a question about aiming for 20 grams of protein in your meal or snack, but what level of carbs, fat, and fiber should go with that?
Yeah, that is the question that changes all the time, right? Because so what we'll talk about next time is that most people need, unless you're really petite, like 120 pounds, most people need a minimum of 65 to 70 grams of protein in their day, in their food, in their meal throughout the day, divided throughout the day, because we can only absorb about 20 grams. So that's part, the 20 grams, that's part of our pie. And then, like, do we need more fat or do we need more carbs? We all need more fiber. Like, the bottom line is, if you really want to do well on fiber, the minimum you should be getting is about 5 cups of veggies, of fresh veggies, or 3 cups of cooked veggies a day. That's like your minimum, which most people aren't even close to that. And then the higher, like, it can go up to, like, depending on the protocol and what you're trying to fix, but up to 10 to 14 cups, which is like a lot, right? Because that helps our gut biome and stuff like that. And I don't really get into, like, I don't think over forcing yourself to eat fiber is one thing, but the carb fat really has a lot to do with your genetics and how much exercise you get and how much sleep you get and what your diet history is, what your trauma history is. Like, those ratios really have to be individualized to you, which is why I'm like, how's your energy and mental clarity? And then at the end of the book, we talk about, like, how are your biological metrics doing in terms of labs? Like, are you meeting your needs? So, like, my husband, he has genetics. He comes from a part of Poland that, like, just got washed between all Russia, Austria, Germany. He is solid peasant stock, and he can make triglycerides and cholesterol out of air. I'm pretty sure he can, because, like, he looks at a carb and his cholesterol goes up, because I'm sure he ate, his family ate grass to survive, because they were just always being, like, surviving some famine, some war. Where my body apparently does not make cholesterol at all on its own. I am totally fat dependent. Like, and if I don't get fat in my diet, I feel like crap. And my cholesterol, despite trying my best, like, never deviates above a really low number. And so you really have to, and this is where I think the medical world and even the diet culture really doesn't serve people well, is, like, we have to know about our own bodies and know how to experiment on our own bodies, because the other piece is, whatever diet you had when you're 20 will not be the diet you can have when you're 30, and certainly won't be in your 40s and 50s. And so, like, there's no one diet that's going to be great for you in your entire life, and it's going to change every decade, if not quicker. So mostly what I really want is people to have the tools and skills and knowledge to change their diet as their circumstances change.
Great. We have some other comments that I thought because we're sort of nearing the end time, I thought I'd just read through them, the 3 that are remaining as of now. So one person shares, as a sugar addict, once told myself I could get a bite or have some in a reasonable portion, and amazingly is no longer chasing it. The all or nothing thinking hasn't worked. So, like, 100% yes or no. And also they make sure that they're having that sugar bit right after dinner seems to help. So same time of day, I think, can be helpful. Another person, Another person says, yes, swimming in the sea of processed food that is the American experience makes keto pretty impossible. You got to be really committed. Another person shared, my husband and I have been successfully eliminating most processed foods and all processed oils. We feel so much better after eating real whole foods, eliminating much of the sugar cravings as well. Also not as expensive as many people think, as you're no longer buying all that junk, learning so much, and thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I want to just pick up on some of that. Like one of the things that Kristen and I talk about, and it comes out in our book, is like really focusing on initially when you're starting out, just trying to add in that little bit of extra protein and not getting too caught up in, oh, I should do this or shouldn't do that, or the shaming that we all do to some extent around food, but like just focus on getting a little bit more protein in initially, and other things will sort of come as you start having more energy and mental clarity.
And the other thing about the book is, although we're doing it in order, we tried really hard to write the book so that if you're having sleep issues, you can be just like, I'm reading the sleep chapter, and I may not understand everything because I didn't understand the physiology, but like, I'm just going to do these experiments. So like, you can just pick up a piece of it and do a place of it. And somebody was when we were writing the book, they're like, well, you should do it like improve your mental health in 30 days. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way. Like nobody does that. Like, I'm more interested, and you can use the book for however you're going to use the book. Like we have let go, like the book is going to have its own life, but the idea of it is like, let's layer in these skills. And when, something happens and we lose all those skills, which we always do, like, then we come back and we're like, oh, right. I remember when I did, I had breakfast, I felt better. Okay, let's just go back to starting with breakfast and not doing this whole like exercise and and like this whole thing that we can't hold up, and integrate it into our lives so that like most of us will brush our teeth even on the worst, terrible, horrible, no good day. And with years of practice, what I have seen with clients who we just have one stress event over another, that they're like, oh, during a stress event, I need to feed myself. The day will go better. Feeding myself anything is better than being perfect. And so that was the intention of the book, is to just be like, here are the experiments, be kind to yourself, be compassionate, and just try, and then integrate the tools as you see fit. So hopefully that's what we do. We tried our best. And we're really excited that you all came and joined us. So we're going to wrap up at 5:30. If you want to leave with like, what are you going to try? What's your 15% solution? And this is like a solution that you can just do because you have all the resources, and you're just it takes very little effort for you to do, even just a day or a couple of days. If what studies show is, if you just type in what you're going to do before you leave, the likelihood of you doing it goes up, and so then you just a little more help along the way. So you want to sign out that way, that would be awesome. And we just really appreciate all of you taking the time to come and play with us for an hour and a half.
Yeah. And so while you all are doing that, and thank you so much, it's great. Kristen just put up there, we had one of the questions, when are the next sessions? So the next one, it's every 2 weeks for 3 sessions. So the next one is October 4th, all at the same time. So that's 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, and in between you can find your time zone. And like I said in the beginning, you don't necessarily need to have come to this one. So if in order to participate in the other one. So I just put in the chat box the link to register. It's also still on the WFAN website and on the homepage of kristenallett.com. And so feel free to let other folks know if you want to invite friends, family, colleagues to join in. The registration is just going to be open right up until October 18th when we start the last set of the 3 sessions. So feel free. And then the other thing, in addition to thinking about what you're going to do, In the next section of the book, you'll see that one of the chapters is about labels. And so just an open invitation, if you think of it, to bring a label of your favorite food. And we're going to be discussing that in the next time we meet on October 4th. And so with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for taking time out of your late afternoon evenings or whatever time it is. And we're asking for the link again. I'm just putting that link again to join, to register, but it's also on the homepage of KristenAllett.com. And I think you have to scroll down, but it's on the WFAN website as well. And thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody. A good rest of your day. And and thank you for all the thanks. It's lovely. We'll see you in a couple weeks.